Nous sommes nombreux à avoir une idée de ce qu'est la philosophie des Lumières. Elle affirme l'usage de la raison, la recherche empirique et la liberté individuelle. Depuis que le mouvement des Lumières a vu le jour, il a connu l'opposition non seulement de certaines autorités politiques et religieuses, mais également d'intellectuels qui se sont battus contre les idées des Lumières, du XVIIIe et du XVIIIe siècle à nos jours. Dans cet épisode, je reçois Graeme Garrard, qui est un spécialiste des anti-lumières, ou en anglais du Counter Enlightenment, ou encore en allemand de la Gegenaufklärung. Il a soutenu dans l'un de ses livres qu'il a existé de nombreuses vagues de Gegenaufklärung qui ont cru et parfois décru à travers les siècles. Dans cet échange, nous discutons entre autres de l'état actuel du Gegenaufklärung. Most of us have an idea of what the philosophy of the Enlightenment is. It advocates human reason, empirical inquiry, and personal freedom. Ever since the Enlightenment was born as a movement, there have been not only political and religious authorities, but also intellectuals as well, who have fought against these Enlightenment ideas, from the 17th and the 18th centuries to the present. In this episode, I interview Graeme Garrard. Dr. Garrard is a specialist of counter-Enlightenment ideas. He has argued in one of his books that many different waves of counter-Enlightenment thought have waxed and sometimes waned throughout the centuries. We discuss the current state of counter-Enlightenment thought, what the counter-Enlightenment might have gotten right, and other things. So I'm thrilled to be here with Dr. Graeme Garrard. Dr. Garrard, you're a reader in politics at Cardiff University in Wales. You graduated with your PhD in 1995 from Oxford University. The title of your dissertation was Mestre Judge of Jean-Jacques, an examination of the relationship between Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Joseph de Maistre, and the French Enlightenment. You published two books. First, in 2003, there was this one, Rousseau's Counter Enlightenment, a Republican critique of the philosophe. And then in 2005, Counter Enlightenments, from the 18th century to the present, the latter of which I greatly enjoyed reading, I must say. So I would say that it's pretty common for people to know about the Enlightenment. You hear about it at school, I guess, at least. Certainly in France you do. But much less so about the Counter-Enlightenment, that's for sure. So could you first broadly explain what the Counter-Enlightenment is?
Yes. My second book you mentioned is called Counter Enlightenments. It's in the plural.
It is.
So the idea is that there is really no single movement we could call the Counter Enlightenment, but rather a whole series of arguments and ideas that have been presented against the Enlightenment really from the middle of the 18th century right up to the present.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to leave you with the impression that there's a single counter-Enlightenment movement, but a whole series of different arguments and movements, which have one thing in common, and that is their common opposition to the core ideas of the Enlightenment.
Okay.
Unfortunately, each of these movements have their own idea of what the Enlightenment was. So counter-Enlightenment really involves two things. One is setting up an image of the Enlightenment, and then the other is attacking it.
Mm-hmm.
So you really have a whole series of different portraits of the Enlightenment, and then a whole different range of criticisms. You've got liberals, you've got conservatives, socialists, Marxists, feminists, environmentalists, all of whom have made arguments against the Enlightenment.
Yes.
And so their main focus tends to be on what they see as the distortions of the Enlightenment, and particularly its faith in progress, its belief in reason, and its universalism.
Okay, so we can focus on in this case on specific forms of the Counter Enlightenment, and one of which one of them you've done a lot of work on is the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So in French schools, Rousseau, I would say, is often presented as one of the boys of the Enlightenment, along with Voltaire, Diderot, d'Alembert. He was clearly a central influence on some factions within the French Revolution. So could you explain why he was actually more of a counter-Enlightenment figure?
Yes, you're absolutely right. He's usually identified not just with the Enlightenment, but indeed at the core of the Enlightenment. He lived in Paris, although he wasn't French.
Mm-hmm.
He lived in Paris and associated with the philosophe. He contributed to the great writing project of the Enlightenment in France, which was the Encyclopédie. So for all those reasons, he appears to be on the side of the Enlightenment. But he was alienated from the philosophe. He fell out with the philosophe. He grew to hate Voltaire. He attacked the idea that science and reason are the best routes to human happiness. He rejected the idea of human progress. He thought that human history was actually a history of decline rather than improvement. He advocated a policy of patriotism, of promoting national differences. For example, he wrote a book on government of Poland, in which he advocated strong nationalistic policy against the universalism of the Enlightenment. And his first major publication, his Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, advocates ignorance.
Yes.
He says knowledge and reason are corrupting. He also advocated sumptuary laws because he was a Calvinist in his background, whereas the philosophe advocated the dissemination of luxury goods, the purchase and trade in luxury goods, in order to promote human well-being. So if you go through each of these points, you see that, in fact, the Counter-Enlightenment, or this is what I argue, emerged really from the very heart of the Enlightenment through its first enemy, which was one of its own members, who defected from the movement to its opposition. And you're right, he did influence the French revolutionaries, whose own, particularly the more radical ones like Robespierre, whose actual policies, when in power, didn't exactly promote enlightenment.
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, in your book, you explain that Rousseau first changed his mind when he wrote, the text which you just mentioned. And was it not sort of a challenge for him at first that he agreed to write a text to argue against the Enlightenment, but at first it was not his position. He was just trying to argue a position which was not his, and then got sort of caught up in the game.
Yes, that was his first major publication. He was particularly well known at that point in Paris. He was known as a composer mainly at that point. Yes, it was an essay competition which he entered, and the question was, do the arts and sciences corrupt our morals? And he answered, surprisingly, yes, they do. Now, there's a debate. Diderot, who was his friend, had an argument with him, and they fell out and became bitter enemies later on, as almost everyone did with Rousseau. And he later claimed, Diderot later claimed, that it was his idea, almost as an act of perversity, to argue that arts, the dissemination and popularization of the arts and sciences, the promotion of the arts and sciences actually corrupts morals. It doesn't enhance or improve them.
Yes.
Rousseau denied this. He claimed this was his own idea. And by that point, they had fallen out and were bitter enemies. So we'll never really know exactly where the truth lies. But the argument that Rousseau made in that essay, he later viewed as somewhat crude, and he wasn't happy with it.
Okay.
But he never repudiated its basic arguments and ideas. And I think that's the most important point.
Mm-hmm.
He went on in his later writings to, I believe, expand and develop those ideas, which were, in their original form, somewhat crude, somewhat simplistic, but nonetheless quite radical, because they went right at the heart, against the very heart of the Enlightenment.
Okay. So if we go back in time, I think the first scholar who dedicated some of his scholarship to the Counter Enlightenment was Isaiah Berlin. Right?
Well, Isaiah Berlin is not the first person to refer to the counter.
Okay.
Although he is often believed to be, but he published a very influential essay in the early 1970s. I think it was 1973, called The Counter Enlightenment. And many people think that was the first use of the term. In fact, in English. The term was used in the late 19th century, actually. But Rousseau's essay, Berlin's essay, you're quite right, is the most influential in promoting the idea that there was a movement against the Enlightenment. And in a lot of scholarship on the Counter-Enlightenment comes after that essay. And that's what attracted me to go to Oxford, because Berlin supervised my own scholarship on the Counter-Enlightenment. But since then, many scholars have traced the origins of this idea back rather further into the past.
Yes.
But these earlier examples were not very systematic, and they're very, very obscure, very hard to find. So we really should credit Berlin with raising the profile of the concept of the Counter-Enlightenment.
Yes.
Even if he was the originator of it.
Okay. Yeah, so my next...
I could add one point. The word Gegenaufklärung, pardon my pronunciation, but the German term, this goes back much, much earlier.
I see.
Into the late 18th, early 19th centuries.
Okay.
100 years even earlier than in English.
I see.
So the concept in English, the word, the phrase, Counter-Enlightenment, is much earlier than Berlin's essay. And the German term is even much earlier than that.
Okay. So my next question is about, well, essentially what you just mentioned 1 minute ago, but maybe we can go a little deeper, because Berlin identified the German romantics, especially, for instance, the likes of Hamann and Herder, as the key figures of the early Counter-Enlightenment. And more recently, and this is what you alluded to, I think, for instance, there was this book by Darren McMahon, who has argued that the Counter-Enlightenment was very much underway in the 18th century in France. So, yeah, could you comment on this?
Yes. I disagree with Berlin on this. Berlin believed that the French Revolution was continuous with the French Enlightenment, that they both were engaged in the same project to rationalize society so it conforms with reason. And therefore, he saw the excesses, the violent excesses of the French Revolution as in some ways, the natural and inevitable outcome of the forced implementation of Enlightenment ideas. And that's why he really starts the story of the Counter Enlightenment after that.
Yes.
As you say, during the period of Romanticism in the early 19th century. I don't agree with this view. I think there's lots of evidence that opposition to the Enlightenment came much, much earlier. So obviously Rousseau is an example. Berlin doesn't accept that. Berlin thinks Rousseau was very much in the mainstream of the Enlightenment. So Berlin's wrong on that. Also, I have a chapter in my book between Rousseau and before the Romantic period on the counter-revolution. And that begins in the 1790s. Almost exactly when the revolution begins, it gives birth at the same time to its own enemies, the counter-revolutionaries. Joseph de Maistre is an example. Edmund Burke was a counter-revolutionary figure as well. And the Abbé Baruel. There are quite a lot of them. And they turned against the revolution and blamed the Enlightenment for causing the revolution. And so in their minds, the Enlightenment was a dangerous thing because it undermines and destabilizes society and governments. And this is what you end up with. You end up with a revolution and a tyranny. So this all happens before the Romantic Age. So to go back to my original point when we started, the history of Counter-Enlightenment thought comes in stages. In my book, I try to distinguish. And so there's a stage before in the Romantic period, which is the counter-revolution. And many of those critics and enemies of the Enlightenment were religious and saw the revolution and the Enlightenment as atheistic and nihilistic. So I think that I agree with Darren McMahon, a very eminent scholar, that the origins of counter-Enlightenment thought have to be traced back further.
Yeah.
Although I have to say, Berlin does go back even to antiquity, to ancient Greece. He sees evidence in ancient Greece of arguments against the concept of enlightenment, in various skeptics, philosophical skeptics. But really for Berlin, although there are these early examples, isolated examples in history, counter-Enlightenment thought really takes off with Romanticism. Whereas for me, it really takes off earlier than that. At least one or maybe even two generations earlier.
Okay. So still in the same book, Counter Enlightenment, well, this is what you open with. So to say, you've identified several very different waves of Counter Enlightenment, from the Catholic reactionaries to the German Romantics to Friedrich Nietzsche in his later years at least, to the Frankfurt School, to the postmodernists. Okay, I'm skipping over several others actually. So which waves of counter-enlightenment would you say have the most relevance today? So if I were to give my own educated guess, I would say maybe the religious reactionaries and the postmodernists.
Yes, I think that's correct. Depends what you mean by religious reactionaries. Certainly, the one common misconception of the Enlightenment is that it was atheistic, it was anti-religious. It was not. There were a few atheists among the philosophes, La Métrie and the Baron d'Holbach. There were a few, but they were very rare. For the most part, the philosophes were deists, not Christians. They were anti-Christian and they disliked organized religion, but they were not anti-religious. In fact, most of them were anti-religious. Voltaire, for example, Voltaire said, "Si Dieu n'existait pas, il faudrait inventer." If God did not exist, we would have to invent him. So, one of the common perceptions of the Enlightenment's enemies is to portray it as atheistic. So, in fact, it was not. So, in fact, many of the religious critics of the Enlightenment were simply setting up what we say in English a straw man, a fake position, and then attacking that. So that's why I say one has to be specific about what religious perspective you're taking on this.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. Through history, since the 18th century, very many religious conservatives have been hostile to the Enlightenment because they saw it as atheistic, as anti-religious, and as dangerous. In our own time, one could argue that that the biggest threat to Enlightenment beliefs in the West comes from certain radical forms of Islam.
Mm-hmm.
Not all Muslims, indeed, but certain radical forms of Islam, I think, are quite unambiguously Counter Enlightenment, and I don't think they would deny that.
Yeah.
Oh, I have to say, I'm not an expert on Islam, and I'm not saying this is true of Islam in general, but only of the more radical elements within it. Just as there has been through history among among Christian radicals and conservatives, has been quite, like Joseph de Maistre, for example, has been very hostile to many of the basic principles of the Enlightenment. And on postmodernism, I think among intellectuals,
Yes.
that's been certainly the main source of criticism of the Enlightenment. So I mentioned this in my book as well, the chapter on that as well.
So, well, this is a perfect transition to the next question, actually, because I hear a lot about the sorry state of academia, especially maybe intellectual honesty, intellectual diversity in the Anglosphere. You know, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom. So in the universities in those countries, of course, it's not a new phenomenon. There were books from the 90s talking about this, I think. But it seems to have gotten worse, perhaps in the past few years. Are those things that you encounter in your professional life? So, for instance, I had a look at the Spiked magazine ranking of freedom of speech at universities, and Cardiff University has a red light, so to say, meaning the highest level of censorship. I also saw that you registered at on the site Heterodox Academy, so I think probably you could comment on that.
Yes. Let's see. There is a lively debate going on, both within and particularly without universities in the Anglosphere, for want of a better term, over whether universities have now become hostile to free speech, mm-hmm. freedom of expression, and also hostile to a conception of the truth, which predominated during the Enlightenment, but has been undermined and questioned since, particularly by, for example, postmodernists, mm-hmm. who tend to question the very idea of the truth as anything objective.
Yes.
And this is given some examples of people who've argued this. As you mentioned, Spiked website, Brendan O'Neill, who edits this, is very insistent that universities have become averse to free speech, to Enlightenment ideals of free exchange of ideas, of intellectual progress, of science. There are lots of others. Christopher Hitchens was the champion of this idea. There are the so-called new atheists, Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, all of whom are liberals in the Enlightenment tradition, who value reason and science and debate and speech. And so recent developments in university cultures in the English-speaking world are interpreted by people of that ilk to be a major betrayal of the idea of a university. That's a sanctuary for free speech and the free expression of ideas. And many of them reach back to the Enlightenment and invoke the tradition of the Enlightenment against its, what they perceive as its enemies in universities today.
I see. But would you say that their concern is justified, and if so, to which extent? Maybe it's a very difficult question, but
it is a difficult question, and you are wanting me to take a position on this.
If you want.
Yeah, I think their concerns are justified. And I do think that there has been a trend of at least 5 years, maybe longer, and particularly escalated in recent years, that is hostile to an Enlightenment tradition of debate, which has traditionally been at the core of modern university. And so some examples of this, so-called no platforming, disallowing certain people from having a forum for expressing their views and defending their positions, articulating their positions. Safe spaces, freedom of speech, freedom of expression is suspended in deference to the sensitivities of certain groups. Those sorts of things. Demonstrations that shout down speakers on the grounds that their views are illegitimate and should not be given expression, should not be tolerated. Censorship, active and passive, various kinds within universities. Now, having said all that, I have not personally experienced this in my own career. And nor do I believe that my own university is guilty of this.
I see.
Not officially, anyway. And so the study that you mentioned by Spiked, I think it was.
It was, yeah.
Which assesses universities over free speech and censorship, and finds the overwhelming majority of British universities get a red flag, meaning fall well short of the standard for openness and free exchange of ideas and free expression. I think some questions should be raised about the methodology behind that.
Okay.
It's not entirely clear. And I haven't seen evidence of it in my own case. There have been some high-profile instances, but very often these have been instances where students have demonstrated or protested vocally without the support or approval of the university. And so it's not clear to me from the Spiked list whether they're referring to universities' official policies or whether they're referring to events and incidents, which may or may not be beyond the control of a given university. For example, the feminist Germaine Greer was invited to Cardiff University amid a great deal of controversy. A protest was launched against this on the ground she had denied that transgender people, particularly men who had become women through a change in identity, were really women.
Yeah.
This outraged transgender people, some of them anyway, but the university did not prevent her from coming and speaking. And so, in fact, she did come and speak. So, would Spike count that as evidence of censorship or not?
Okay, well, that's a good question. One should go back to the details of the study. I don't have them in mind right now, but that's a good remark, for sure.
And also, I teach very controversial subjects. I teach political philosophy and the history of political ideas, not just the Enlightenment, but everything after that, Nietzsche and Marx and etc., both of whom advocated violence. We discuss it in class. We discuss freedom of speech. I teach John Stuart Mill, who famously defended free speech. Mm-hmm. And I've never in my career ever had anyone officially tell me or even hint or suggest that any of this is illegitimate, that I shouldn't expose students to radical ideas or discourage me or prevent me from discussing those ideas. Even people like Karl Marx, who advocated violence as a legitimate political method, as did, say, Machiavelli. So, again, I don't see any evidence of it personally, yes, in my own case, of the university intruding itself in any way in this. And also, British universities are have a statutory obligation to uphold freedom of speech, mm-hmm, a legal requirement to hold freedom of speech. Of course, freedom of speech is not absolute. That lies the problem.
Yes.
And also, unlike American universities, British universities are publicly funded and therefore are required to conform, in most cases, to public standards. Mm-hmm. And therefore are required to uphold freedom of speech.
Got it. So moving back maybe to the book, would you say that, well, for all its flaws, would you say that the Counter Enlightenment has made some good points?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a matter of choosing one side or the other. So Michel Foucault once said, he wrote an essay on the Enlightenment, he once said in it that he called this the blackmail of the Enlightenment. The idea that you need to choose one side or the other. It's not that simple. Mm-hmm. The Enlightenment was right in some things and wrong in others, and the Counter Enlightenment was right in some things and wrong in others. I know that sounds like a very evasive answer, but it's true of almost everything. No one gets everything right. Mm-hmm. Some people get everything wrong. I know some people like that, but no one gets everything right. No one in history has gotten everything right. Mm-hmm. So that includes Enlightenment. So you pick and choose. And in the Counter Enlightenment thinkers have hits and misses. In fact, I think there's a section in my book called that. Hits and misses.
Yes, there is.
And so, I mean, I'll give you an example of a hit. The Enlightenment faith in reason was by no means absolute. This is a common misconception. Mm-hmm. Many of the philosophers were quite well aware of the limits of human reason. But nonetheless, there was a general faith in reason as the vehicle for human improvement, and particularly the application of reason through science, through scientific method of experimentation. Most of the mainstream philosophers really did believe, I think, that science was the path to human improvement. And religion, particularly organized religion, was the opposite of that.
Yeah.
They wanted to crush organized religion. Écraser l'infâme, as Voltaire said, crush this infamous thing, religion, and replace it with a new approach to knowledge, which was science. This, from the perspective of the 18th century, this seems reasonable and benign. From the perspective of the early 21st century, I don't think we can have quite so much faith in science as the solution to our problems. I'm not saying that it should be thrown out. This is not an anti-science position.
Yes.
Least of all physics. But I do think that science increases human power, and this is what the philosophes believed. And they thought this would enhance human power in order to improve the human condition, which is entirely true.
Mm-hmm.
So the example I give in my book at the beginning is medical science. A good example of what the philosophe had in mind about the positive uses that knowledge can bring to humans through science. But increasing human power also increases the human power for evil as well as good. And this is something that, say, Friedrich Nietzsche appreciated. So if knowledge is power, if truth is power, it's the power that can be used for good or evil. And as it increases, then so does the power of humans to destroy each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the 21st century, we have nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons that are all products of modern science, which didn't exist in the 18th century. And so when you embrace science as the paradigm of knowledge, you have to accept, I think, that this is going to bring great benefits and great risks to humanity. That we're bound to be more ambivalent about science than the philosophes were with their, what seems perhaps from our jaded eyes, a more naive idea of science. So that's just one example.
Yes. Well, maybe you have a second example that you could give me of a hit.
Of a hit, okay. The Enlightenment belief in empiricism,
Mm-hmm.
which was the view that the mind is a blank slate, a carte blanche. And this derived from a very important, influential English philosopher named John Locke, one of the heroes of the French philosophe, greatly admired by all of them, particularly by Voltaire. And he wrote an essay on understanding, which is a theory of the human mind as a blank slate, born with nothing on it.
Yeah.
We come to knowledge of the world through our sensory impressions of the world. So impressions enter our mind through our senses. These form impressions on our mind, and this blank slate is then filled up with knowledge. And this became the dominant epistemology of the Enlightenment. That's not a view I think many people in the 21st century would accept. It's very simplistic. And epistemology, which is the science of understanding, the philosophy of understanding, of knowledge, has moved really away from that view in the last 2 centuries towards a much, much more complicated view in which the mind plays a more active role in knowledge. And so I think here some of the critics of the Enlightenment have been right in portraying it as naive and simplistic conception of the human mind, as a blank slate.
Yeah. Okay.
But and this, perhaps ironically, this more complex view is itself, to a large extent, a consequence of advances in human science.
Yes.
In neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, behavioralism, things like that. So in embracing science, the philosophe also embraced empiricism.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's more complicated than that.
Well, there is the self-correcting process, which can be said to be, well, if not a saving grace, at least a redeeming feature of all this.
Yes, there's a notion in German. I have to defer to your German here, so perhaps you help. But I think it is eine Aufklärung über die Aufklärung.
Okay.
What does that suggest to you? How would you translate that?
Well, an enlightenment, either over the enlightenment or maybe about the enlightenment.
Yeah. So this idea is argued by a class of thinkers I mentioned in this book I wrote. I call them critics of the Enlightenment, and I distinguish them from enemies of the Enlightenment. So enemies of the Enlightenment are people who really comprehensively reject Enlightenment values and beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Hamann, for example, might be a good example of that. Whereas critics of the Enlightenment, people like Hegel, for example, or in our own time, Jürgen Habermas, who's still alive, they argue that the Enlightenment is deficient, but they don't reject the Enlightenment, so they want to improve it. They want to enlighten the Enlightenment about itself. So this is what Hegel calls an Aufhebung. Aufhebung, where you have an opposite and you have a thesis, an antithesis, and a higher synthesis, where you take what's right about both elements and you combine them into a higher understanding. And perhaps that's the way forward, is not to think in terms of just enlightenment and counter-enlightenment, but to consider what each side got right and ascend to a higher level of understanding, particularly about the Enlightenment.
Okay. So I don't know if you are familiar with the book Explaining Postmodernism by Stephen Hicks.
No.
You're not? Okay, well, it's pretty recent as well. And I would say that it reads pretty much like an intellectual history of the Counter Enlightenment as well. Even though the main goal is to explain the intellectual roots of postmodernism, he finds himself retracing much of what yourself talk about, actually, I would say. So if I compare your account with his, I see that in his account there are two important figures which are not present in yours. The first one is Immanuel Kant, and the second one is Martin Heidegger. So of course the two thinkers could hardly be more different from one another. Kant was a friend of the Enlightenment on the whole, both politically and intellectually, I would guess. But in the book, Stephen Hicks argues that Kant's radical epistemic skepticism opened the way for the counter-enlightenment attack on reason from Hegel to the postmodernists. What do you make of that?
Well, I haven't read it, so putting me on the spot a bit here, yes, in asking me to take a view, but I will in any event. I'll comment on Kant, and perhaps not necessarily on Hicks's view or presentation of Kant, because I don't know it.
Yeah.
Kant is highly problematic for this schema of Enlightenment, counter-Enlightenment, because he wrote in the 1790s, well, 1780s, 1790s, although he's considered an exemplary figure of the German Aufklärung, mm-hmm, he nonetheless did subject empiricism to systematic critique.
Yes.
Indeed, this was in many ways his greatest accomplishment, mm-hmm, is to attack this notion I mentioned of empiricism. Mm-hmm. For example, he read a leading Enlightenment thinker and was deeply influenced by him, David Hume, the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who was an empiricist. And he famously said, having read David Hume's writings, that he woke him up from his dogmatic slumbers. And so Kant, one of Kant's main projects was to come up with an improved understanding of reason,
Yes.
and of human knowledge, which made him criticize and retreat from empiricism. So knowledge and understanding becomes a matter not just of perceptions, but of conceptions.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very crude view, I have to say, but it's not a matter of a passive mind passively receiving sensory impressions. It's the mind brings conceptions to the perceptions, and together knowledge is formed out of that meeting of those two elements. So the mind is more active. And also, Kant was a very deep philosopher, unlike most philosophers who were not deep philosophers. Very few of them were philosophers. None of them were academics.
Mm-hmm.
And very few of them were really very original philosophers, really. They were popularizers of ideas, like Voltaire, for example. Kant was a very deep philosopher and was reflected on the limits of reason and could see the problems and the paradoxes and aporias that comes with reasoning about reason. And this, it could be argued, has advanced the cause of those against the Enlightenment who are skeptical of empiricism, skeptical of a superficial view of reason, for example. But it doesn't automatically make Kant on one side or the other. I'm sure if you asked Kant, what are you on? In fact, he said as much, I'm on the side of Enlightenment.
Yes.
But what Enlightenment was he talking about? Not really the French Enlightenment. And the French Enlightenment was not the same as the German Enlightenment. That's why many scholars now don't like the term the Enlightenment. They refer to enlightenments.
Okay.
And that's why I chose the title of my book, Counter Enlightenments. But the point is that when Kant took his stand with the Enlightenment, he was clearly on the side of the Aufklärung in Germany. He wasn't necessarily on the side of the French Enlightenment and everything that it stood for. So I think Kant is a really, really difficult figure to put into this schema.
Yes.
And many scholars would say, well, that proves the schema's limitations, Enlightenment, Counter-Enlightenment, because there's so many figures who really don't fit either side. Another example, Herder. He's writing around the same time. He doesn't fit very neatly into either category. Neither does Hegel, for that matter. So there are quite a few thinkers in this period of the late 18th, early 19th centuries, in the transition, a major transition period in European history, who really don't fit one or the other, who are in some respects critical of aspects of the Enlightenment, but by no means reject it in its entirety.
Mm-hmm.
As for Heidegger, I have to confess, I'm certainly no expert.
Mm-hmm.
Heidegger is a notoriously obscure, and I think, Heidegger did not make the Enlightenment an issue.
Yeah, that's what you say in your book, yeah.
And so really my feeling is, in terms of his influence on people who did attack the Enlightenment, that's different. There you make a case.
Yeah.
But with respect to his own writings, the extent that I even understand them, which is highly dubitable, I'm not sure I know where to put him in.
Yeah.
It's not even clear to me he was a philosopher in my understanding of the word.
I see.
Rather than, say, perhaps a mystic.
Wow.
I think much the same of Hegel.
Uh-huh.
who I really don't think was a philosopher in my rather narrow understanding of the word.
Mm-hmm. I see.
Doesn't mean that his writings are illegitimate. The fact that he was a Nazi makes them rather illegitimate. But I'm simply saying that I would be interested to read Hicks now that you've mentioned it.
Oh, yeah.
And see what he says about Heidegger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But you yourself explained that, yeah, as you just told me, that he was not very interested in the Enlightenment. Certainly not directly. Actually, maybe one could say that his rejection of reason encompasses much of the history of Western philosophy. So this is one of the reasons I think that you gave in your book to not treat Heidegger, because he was not directly concerned with the Enlightenment. But I would say that it could be argued that this rejection of Western philosophy as a whole, and its emphasis on reason in particular, is also true to a large extent of Heidegger's followers, namely the French postmodernists.
Yes, there is a certain lineage.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, many of them, many postmodernists, particularly French postmodernists, but by no means only them, trace their lineage intellectually to Heidegger and to Nietzsche. And this may explain some of the problems in the modern university. Because in this approach questions the very concepts of truth and reason. And as has often been pointed out, for example, very effectively, I think, by Habermas, by Jürgen Habermas, he has attacked the contemporary postmodern Nietzscheans. And one of the main arguments he makes is that when you question reason and truth itself and objectivity themselves, really there's nothing you can say on the subject. That he calls this a performative contradiction. To reason about the status of reason and truth presupposes reason and truth.
Mm-hmm.
And if you reject those, really all argument ends. Argument is premised on the mutual acceptance of objectivity, of reason, and of truth. And if those are themselves being questioned, on what basis can they be questioned other than reason, truth, and objectivity? And so I think Habermas is rather brilliant at the way he exposes how circular this kind of reasoning is. And it's an example of it is Nietzsche himself. Nietzsche gets caught in all of these problems of self-contradiction, of big claims which he then says can't exist, aren't true. And this plagues many contemporary postmodernists. And it makes, I think, this is my own view now, an editorial comment, it raises questions about what universities are doing, frankly. The debates and arguments and research that are undertaken in universities are done on the broad assumption that there are answers to those questions that they are pursuing.
Yes.
And if postmodernists come along and say, well, there aren't answers, or the answers are simply expressions of power, of the will to power, as Nietzsche said,
Yeah.
then we have to consider the whole point of universities.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what is happening at the moment.
Yeah. There was a book. It's actually 30 years old now. This book called "The Closing of the American Mind" by Alan David Bloom. Maybe you know it.
I know it very.
You do it. Okay, you do know it. Okay, and therein he argues actually that is the influence of Nietzsche and Heidegger that can be felt in the state of American academia at that time.
Yes. I know this book very well. What can I say on that? Alan Bloom was a Straussian,
Yes.
a follower of Leo Strauss, a student, in fact, of Leo Strauss, the émigré German Jewish philosopher, University of Chicago, right? So Strauss and Alan Bloom are attacking postmodernists for being relativists, which is the same argument in a way that Habermas makes. The sort of ironic point about this is that there are people on both the left and the right who attack postmodernists for being relativists.
Yes.
There are people on both the left and the right who believe in truth and reason. So Strauss and Bloom claim to be Platonists. They're conservatives who believe in the tradition of reason as far back as Plato. But on the other side of the spectrum, you've got people like Noam Chomsky, for example, Jürgen Habermas, who also believe in truth and reason, although on the left. And so they all have attacked the postmodernists for questioning truth and reason, and in the process promoting relativism, promoting nihilism, and undermining justice. There's a famous exchange, you can see it on YouTube, between, from 1971 or thereabouts, between Foucault and Noam Chomsky on Dutch television of all places.
Yeah, I've watched it,
You probably saw that, yes. Well, this really is in many ways the Enlightenment attacking the Counter Enlightenment of Chomsky defending nature, reason, and universalism, ethical universalism, against the radical skepticism of Foucault.
Yes.
This critique of the modern academy from Alan Bloom from 1984.
I think it's 1987, if I remember correctly.
1987. Yeah, that was an early form of this from the right, from what you might call the universalist right.
Yeah.
But you know, they're not. This critique is not the unique property of just conservatives or
that's for sure.
Or just socialists.
Yeah, that's for
This
sure.
is one of the ironies of it.
Yeah.
Some conservatives and some socialists agree on this point.
Yeah. Okay, so I think this was my last question, actually. But I don't know if there is something you might want to add or elaborate upon.
Not really, no. We covered pretty much territory. I spoke too long. This is the common vice of academics, is to give long answers to short questions.
I think it's the goal of this format to, give oneself time to explore, and I think, it's very nice.
It was enjoyable. It was fun to talk about.
Well, thanks very much for agreeing to do this.
My pleasure. If you have any other questions that occur to you, let me know.
Okay, sure, I will then.
And good luck with it.
Well, thanks very much.
Do let me know when it appears.
Yes, I will. Okay.
Nice to talk to you.
Thanks very much.
Au revoir.